It was almost real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 106. Hello, and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling between the 1860s and 1930. And in this episode, I'll discuss one of the early regular wrestling cards in Atlanta, Georgia during 1926. But first, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and I heard Rob Gronkowski, talking about a football player on one of the draft shows whose name is Emeka Ibuka. And Gronk butchered this name. I think he called him Emeka Abekbu, was how he said his name. But the reason it tickled me is it reminded me of Dan and the way Dan would butcher names, particularly on the show. For the longest time, I thought he was doing the old Chris Jericho gimmick where he would just butcher the person's name on purpose to say, this person really doesn't mean that much to me. I couldn't be bothered enough to learn how to pronounce her name correctly. But he was over at the house. He used to come over to the house for dinner quite often. And he and my sons would talk more than me and my sons would. He was the fun uncle. So they're sitting there talking about something. And Dan says, yeah, when those files come out from that Michael Eckstein, there's going to be a lot of people in trouble. I'm like, who is Michael Eckstein? Now, I don't really pay attention to popular culture or their conspiracy theories, but I do normally know kind of what's going on in the news, although I have to admit, over the last year, I've watched a lot less of it. And I was Michael Eckstein. I said, there was an old baseball player for the Cardinals named Eckstein, but I don't know a Michael Eckstein that's in the news recently. And Dan said, yeah, you do. You know who it is. It's the creeper that liked the young girls and was victimizing them. And I thought for a second and I said, are you talking about Jeffrey Epstein? And he goes, oh, yeah, yeah, that's the guy's name. And then I realized he wasn't doing the gimmick. Dan, in his older age, just didn't care to memorize people's names. So he would say something close and figure that was good enough, because he would do that not only with this case, but constantly he would be doing that. And I'd say, are you doing that on purpose? Or you just not remember how to say their name? And he says, I ain't got time to memorize these people's names. So I guess it's good that we were close when we were kids, or, I might have been Kevin or Keith. The reason I picked this week's history topic is because of my disappointment with a documentary about Atlanta wrestling. But before I jumped into Atlanta wrestling, I just wanted to do a quick 10-minute overview of Whig presidential history, because that's about all it'll take. And it was in response to a trivia question I saw about who was the last Whig president, which could be a bit of a trick question, because I would normally ask, so are you talking about last elected or last serving? So the Whig Party was a party that only existed for about 20 years in the 18th century. They were they came into being as a protest against Andrew Jackson and his kind of imperial presidency aspirations. He stretched presidential power in a way that hadn't been done before, not anywhere close to what's being done today, but in a way that hadn't really been done before. It broke a lot of precedents. And so the Whig Party believed in a strong Congress and a weak presidency, and they were only in existence for about 20 years because the one main question that really dominated 19th century politics in the United States until the Civil War was the issue of slavery, and they basically ducked it. Northern Whigs in general were not in favor of it, but there were a lot of Southern Whigs who they didn't want to offend, so they just kind of tried to avoid the topic altogether. And eventually other parties rose up and took the space that they weren't willing to take. But they were a party for about 20 years, and they had four presidents who served 8 years altogether, which, if you know anything about United States history, you know that that is not possible unless the president has died. And that actually happened in both cases for the elected Whigs. So two Whig presidents were elected. Two Whig presidents served out the remainder of their term. And as a matter of fact, the first Whig president who died in office was William Henry Harrison in 1841. And it was his presidency and the ascension of John Tyler, who was the vice president, to the presidency that set up the precedent of the vice president serving out the president's remaining term if he died in office. The Constitution and the article about that is not as clear as you would think. There was a lot of confusion around, well, would Tyler be president? And Tyler consulted with the Chief Justice, was sworn in as president, and it set the precedent until, I believe it was 1967. The 21st Amendment codified that, and I put the presidential line of succession in place that we know of today. That was because William Henry Harrison liked to run around Washington, D.C. in March when it was cold and wet without a hat and coat on. He gave a 2 hour inaugural speech, which is still the longest inaugural speech in history. I thought that that's why he got pneumonia from. Nobody's quite sure because for like 2 weeks after that, he ran around Washington without a coat and a hat on all the time, rode his horse. But he got deathly ill at the end of March and he died on April 4th. So he was only in the presidency for 4 weeks, the shortest presidency in United States history. John Tyler served out the remainder of his term. Zachary Taylor, who was a general who fought in the Mexican American War, he fought in a lot of wars, actually. He was a professional soldier with unknown political views. But because he was popular, the Whigs drafted him to run for president, and he won in 1848. He died within 16 months of stomach cancer. I think his is the third shortest presidency. But then Millard Fillmore served out his presidency. So over a 12-year period, because it was 1841 to 1845, James K. Polk served as president from 1845 to 1849. Then Zachary Taylor was elected. Then Millard Fillmore served out his remaining term. And then I almost said sentence, like it was a prison sentence. Served out his remaining term. And that's the end of the Whig presidencies with Fillmore. So over a 12-year period, you have five presidents of the United States. That could be a trivia question in itself. This week, I was looking on YouTube for something to review, and I found a documentary on Georgia Championship Wrestling. And Georgia Championship Wrestling in its modern form from the late 1970s until the 1984 when Vince McMahon was able to get the company away from Ole Anderson, who had disaffected a lot of the other owners. It was probably the most popular promotion in the United States because it was on TBS, one of the first superstation that was on cable television. So people all across the country for the first time saw wrestling outside of their own geographical area. I know that's not the case in New York, but for most of the country, they were seeing Georgia Championship Wrestling. I was not in St. Louis. We did not have cable until 1986. But I did see it when I would go down the country in Scott City. They had cable starting in 1979. So when I would go visit my grandmother, I could see it down there. Well, there was a documentary, looked to be late 80s, early 90s, done on Atlanta promotion. And I didn't get very far into it because the first two matches they showed were not from Atlanta. I knew from previous research and watching. One was a Chicago match, and I think the other one could have been Los Angeles, could have been Dallas. I can't remember what that first match was. The second match though was clearly the double cross in Chicago, where they put the title on Gorgeous George. He beat Chief Don Eagle. That was a double cross, one of the more famous ones. It happened in 1960, and it happened in Chicago. And right after that, they started talking about Paul Jones starting the promotion. Well, Paul Jones bought the Georgia promotion in 1944, but he did not buy the Georgia promotion. So Georgia was running shows going back to the 1880s, just one-off shows here and there. Like you'd have a popular wrestler, maybe an Evan Strangler Lewis. I don't think he wrestled in Atlanta, but just using him as an example, or William Muldoon. They would go through the tour of the southern states and they'd wrestle a local wrestler in Atlanta. So you had those. In 1905, you had a brief local promotional group. They never really attracted any national talent and they did not last but more than the year of 1905. And then you're back to having these little one-off shows until 1926. In 1926, John Contos, who had helped to start the St. Louis promotion for the Chicago office of Ed White, and who had turned that promotion over to his nephew, Tom Pax, when Contos went out on the road and started managing Dan Koloff. 3 years later, in 1926, he kind of settles in Atlanta, and he starts the Atlanta promotion. I think Contos also started the Baltimore promotion, but I'm not quite sure the timeline for that because I've never looked that closely at it. But Contos starts the Atlanta promotion in early 1926. His first card's in January. There's not a whole lot of information about that card. But the second card was in early February, February 9th, 1926. It was a Tuesday. And that card drew 600 fans to the Atlanta City Auditorium. 600 fans probably sounds like a really small card. But in this time frame, that was normally what happened when you started a promotion. I think the first St. Louis card maybe drew 200 or 300 fans. Now, within 3 years, they drew 17,000 fans to St. Louis University Field to see the match between Joe Stecker and Stanislaus Zbyszko, where Stecker beat Stanislaus Zbyszko for the world title that he had just taken from Wayne Big Munn in a shoot in Philadelphia the month prior in April 1925. But in late 1921, early 1922, those St. Louis cards were drawing people in the hundreds, not thousands yet. So it's not unusual that you start out, your early cards only draw a few hundred fans. But it was a very successful promotion right away because in April of 1926, Contos books Joe Stecker to come to defend his version of the World Heavyweight Wrestling Championship in Atlanta. And he's wrestling Stanislaus Zbyszko, and they draw 6,000 fans to the City Auditorium 2 months later. So this promotion is definitely on an upward trajectory. For this second card, he does not have Stecker and Stanislaus Zbyszko. What he does have is Dan Koloff, who he manages, and Vladek Zbyszko, Stanislaus' younger brother, who's based out in New York, wrestling for the Jack Curley promotion. So Contos books this match, and to fill out the card, he has one preliminary bout that's actually a boxing match between two local boxers. It was not unusual for people to fill out their cards this way. St. Louis did it initially too. Within a few years, it's only wrestling. But in those first couple of months to year, when you're trying to build up your promotion and you're trying to get fans in, you're trying to be as broad as possible to attract the casual fans, they would sometimes include local boxing bouts between local boxers because that would guarantee a certain amount of fans would show up for the card. And then in the semi-main event, a Chicago wrestler named John Paxos defeated Atlanta wrestler Martin Blaylock by pinning Martin Blackstock by pinning Blackstock after 36 minutes. So the preliminary boxing bout goes about 12, 15 minutes. The undercard bout goes about 36 minutes. And then you've got the main event, which is going to be a 2 out of 3 falls match under catch can rules. And three matches probably doesn't seem like a whole lot either, but that was the common makeup, particularly for cards you would see in the South or the Midwest at that time. Maybe in LA or New York, you'd get four bouts, but most of the time you're talking two or three. And it was funny in Dallas, I think one of the complaints was always, well, their cards are four matches, which was the old Southern style, because the rest of the country had adapted to six and seven match cards. So Zabisco arrived in Atlanta from New York, and the Atlanta Constitution reporter covering the matches referred to Dan Koloff as the St. Louis Bulgarian. So Koloff, at least in people's mind, is still based out of St. Louis, even though he probably really hasn't been based out of St. Louis for a few years. It's more likely to say he's based out of Atlanta now, since that's where Contos is at. And Contos drafted a local referee named Eddie Hanlon to referee the match. And Hanlon did not did not impress the local newspaper reporter, who said he left a lot to be desired as a wrestling referee. The match starts, and Zabisco and Koloff wrestle for about 20 minutes in the first fall, back and forth. Nobody's really got much of an advantage before before Zabisco throws Koloff four times with headlocks. So the old headlock slam where you grab the person in the headlock and you kind of toss them over your hip, that's what he's using to weaken Koloff for the pin. After the fourth headlock slam, Zabisco pins Koloff for the first fall at 27 minutes, 10 seconds. So they've gone almost a half hour in the first fall. This match is probably going to take an hour to an hour and a half, which was pretty common. Koloff comes out looking stronger in the second fall. Surprise, surprise. Koloff remains on the offensive during the whole second fall, and he finally applies a double arm wrist lock on Zabisco and pins Zabisco in 15 minutes, 57 seconds. This is the fall that the Atlanta Constitution newspaper reporter actually took umbrage with and said that he questioned whether Zabisco's shoulders were really down, but allowed that maybe it was the right decision. The thing about a double arm wrist lock now, I guess I'm going to jump to the punchline. These guys were working this match. A double arm wrist lock you could submit somebody with as well. So they could have covered if somebody didn't think the shoulders down. Yeah, but he gave up. But that was not mentioned at all. So I'm thinking that the double arm wrist lock was just used to get a pin that where Zabisco's shoulders may or may not have been on the mat. They come back for the third fall. We've gone about 45 minutes so far. And the third fall, Zabisco and Koloff are trading offense back and forth for about the first 5 or 10 minutes. And then Zabisco starts to dominate the action. And after trying for headlocks, flying falls, headlock slams, Zabisco finally uses an armbar and pins Koloff in 20 minutes, 10 seconds. So overall, the match goes about an hour and 15 minutes. It was very entertaining because the newspaper reporters and the fans both cheered at the end. Well, I don't think the newspaper reporter cheered, but he wrote a really positive column about it the next day and mentioned how all the fans cheered the match. And you could tell the fans went home happy because within 2 months, they're drawing 6,000 fans to the city auditorium. That only happens because word of mouth is getting out. People are impressed by the shows you're putting on, and they're getting people to come back to the show. And that is the early beginnings of the regular Atlanta promotion. I know that there were times when it was more sparse before Paul Jones really starts promoting in the mid 40s. But you had the Great Depression going on and you had World War II coming into play too. So when Contos transitioned out and when Paul Jones transitioned in, I don't know if it was 1944, I don't know if it was before that, but Atlanta always had a fairly regular promotion from 1926 until 1984. Our recommendations this week, Again, I'm going to recommend Irresistible Force: The Life and Times of Gorilla Monsoon by Brian R. Solomon. I'm also going to recommend, since we talked about Whig presidential history, I did read a biography. I've never read a biography on Henry Harrison, John Tyler, or Zachary Taylor. I did read one on Fillmore because Fillmore was somewhat, his life is much more interesting outside of the presidency than when he's in the presidency. So this book was actually enjoyable to read. So I do recommend Millard Fillmore, Biography of a President by Robert J. Rayback. And so I've only got one thing really left that I wanted to cover, and it's a follow up to something I had talked about on the podcast a few months ago. And I always keep this show clean, and it will be clean. I'm not going to cuss, but the observation I'm going to make might lead to uncomfortable questions if you've got children listening to this with you. So you may not want them to listen to the last segment. A couple of weeks ago, I was sitting on the exercise, but it was a Sunday morning. I was sitting on the exercise bike in the gym, and two guys got into an argument over the fan. It really wasn't about the fan. One guy came in, turned the fan out of the CrossFit room, and the other guy said, "Hey, I was using that. If you want to use it, just ask me." And he said, "I'm using this fan, and you're not going to." Clearly being the aggressor. Well, this guy he was talking to wasn't going to just be pushed around and told it. And he said, "No, you need to learn how to share stuff." And it led to some very heated words. So I'm trying to diffuse this thing. And I said, "Guys, this is over a fan. It's not worth losing your gym membership over. It's not worth getting into a fight about. Just take it to Mike, who's the gym owner, and let him settle it. You guys aren't going to settle it this morning." And I thought I had him diffused, but the guy that had been the aggressor the whole time pushed the other guy. I commend him for his restraint, because I think he thought about popping the guy, but he went over and picked up his phone and started to call the police. Soon as he did that, the guy turned the fan back to the CrossFit room and took off, and he left the gym. I stuck around because I was going to tell the police what happened, but they didn't even ask me. My guys, if they didn't ask people who were standing around if they had seen anything, they would have been in big trouble. And these officers did not ask anybody else what happened. They just took his statement. He did tell them there's cameras there, and they did contact the gym owners to see the cameras. But I had seen 90% of what went on. They didn't even ask me what happened. So I'm like, well, I wasted 10 minutes of my time waiting for these guys to show up. Flash forward, it was last week or the week before, we bump into each other. The victim of this clown that shoved him. And we start talking. And told him, I said, one of the things that shocked me about that, I said, I'm used to 20-year-olds losing their cool and kind of getting into it with each other. I said, but, people our age, I'm not, used to them having punch ups over fans and stuff like that. And he said, well, I'm so glad I didn't hit him. Do you know that guy's 65 years old? Which I didn't know. Truthfully, he looks like he could be that old, but a lot of people in the gym, you can't really tell their age because they're in better shape than the normal people in their age group. So I knew he was older. I was putting him in the older crowd, but I didn't know he was 65. And when he told me that, I just thought, I didn't tell him this, but I just thought to myself, how small does Mr. Johnson have to be that you are picking a fight with somebody in the gym at 65 years of age? If you think that this is a good idea, once you get past, I don't know, 35, 40, you really need to go talk to somebody, because you've got something seriously wrong going on above the neck, where you think you have to prove your machismo at this late age. By the time you get to be 65, anything you ever had to prove to yourself, you should have already proven a long time ago. So if you think this is a good use of your time, get some help. Well, I think that's it for this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. I know this is a little shorter episode, than I normally do. You know what? I'm going to throw in a little bonus material right here. And then, because this will probably be a topic for a future podcast, and then we'll go ahead and close the show. So this week I was researching the career of Ad Santel because I think this is going to be one of my new research projects. And there are a lot of myths and apocryphal tales around the life and career of Ad Santel. And a lot of them I don't believe. A lot of them I've seen evidence that, he did beat Taro Miyake. He did beat Professor Ito. He beat a bunch of judo people in the 19 teens. Do I think he purposely injured George Hackenschmidt at Frank Gotch's behest to collect $5,000? Absolutely not, because I don't believe Frank Gotch would pay $500 to have an opponent he so easily defeated 3 years earlier to be injured. Particularly, he had seen Gotch wrestling some of the guys in his camp during the matches leading up to his rematch with Hackenschmidt on Labor Day 1911. He knew that Hackenschmidt was not in the condition to be able to beat Gotch. So he's not going to spend $500 to have Santel hurt him on purpose. Do I believe he would give Santel $100 or $200 for information from the camp? Absolutely. I think that would be consistent with Gotch, and I think that would be, if Santel's willing to tell people he hurt one of his mentors for money, I'm sure that he would drop him a little bit of inside information for money as well. Because there's so much myth around Santel, one of the ones I doubted and thought that I could probably disprove pretty quickly was that he went to Japan in the 1920s and defeated a bunch of Kodokan black belts. While researching this past week, I discovered in the spring of 1921 he did in fact go to Japan for about 4 or 5 months. And I know that there was at least one event in Tokyo in April of 1921 where he defeated 2 Kodokan black belts and drew with the other one. Now, his partner slash manager that went with him, he lost all 3 matches to the Kodokan black belts. But Santel won 2 of the matches, and the other match was a draw, but it was a draw just because Santel couldn't make the Kodokan black belt submit. He dominated the match and injured him with a toe hold, injured the black belt's ankle with a toe hold, but the black belt, whose name was Shoji, would just would not give up. So Santel ended up having to settle for a draw in that match. So I know at least one event occurred, and I know he beat 2 and drew with 1. Now, he claimed when he came back that he beat 27 and didn't lose any. Well, I don't see him losing any, but I see him drawing with 1 and winning 2. So hopefully I'll be able to research some of the Kodokan records, or I'll find some more write-ups, because this was a write-up from the Associated Press in Tokyo. So an American newspaper person was there and sent that story back to the United States. That's the only story I've found so far detailing the trip. I find lots of newspaper articles where Santel is telling people what he did, but I haven't found a lot of evidence to corroborate the things that he was saying. But I have now found evidence that he did indeed go to Japan, and he fought at least 3 Kodokan black belts. So more to come on that particular story. As I learn more, I will talk about some of it on the podcast, and of course I'll put it in the book when I get ready to publish it. So Ken Zimmerman Jr. is the place to check out the notes for today's episode. You can find the show notes at kenzimmermanjr.com/episode 106. You can also see what I'm working on currently and a list of books that I've written if you're interested in digging deeper into this era of professional wrestling. Thank you for listening today. I would also be grateful if you would rate this podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to the show. That helps tremendously with keeping the podcast visible so people who have never heard of it can discover it. If you have already done this, thank you so much. And if you would like to comment on this episode or ask a question, please go to kenzimmermanjr.com, find the contact page at the top navigation and drop me an email. And that email is ken@kenzimmermanjr.com. I would love to hear from you. Until next time, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.